Good morning, and thank you, Burke. I welcome you to this particular symposium within the 25th Annual Petersheim Exposition. Today, we will be focusing upon the subject of the people and the cultures of America. Why do we do this? It's primarily because so many of us have such overgeneralized understandings of the founding of this nation, and how we fought to become who we are and where we are today in the 21st century. We find that this is a very, very valuable course to have for future teachers, for lawyers, literally every discipline that a university could teach. So we are so proud and pleased to be a part every year of the Expo. And what we do is we ask some of our students who have been engaged in research and readings to share some of their work with you all in the public. So let's start. If I were giving you all an overview of the nature of the course, which is entitled Peoples and Cultures of America, we offer it as a 6-credit sequence. In the fall, we do 1501, and in the spring, 1502. The only differences in the courses are chronological. We start in 1501 with the beginnings of America, before we had an America, which would be looking at North America and the indigenous nations that did occupy this territory, if you would, before there were any explorations by the Spanish and or the English. In that semester, then we move through the development of capitalism, colonialism, as you can see from the screen, right up through and to World War II. In 1502, we look exclusively at America since World War II to the present, and we even look into the future. How can we do that? Well, through technology, we can almost do all things. But for the most part, we look at trends so that as young people are leaving the university and going out and starting their careers and their families, indeed, we hope that they are enlightened to become better citizens. So as you scan those topics, it just allows you to hopefully get some appreciation for perhaps even understanding the following. If you look at the area under immigration, for example, we look at the patterns and the consequences. Do you know that just about every group that we now call the Americans are basically immigrants to this country? Many came voluntarily. Some came with literally, after they paid for their tickets on ships, were paying with their last literal dime. And there were others who were forced to come here for reasons of indebtedness, enslavement, and so forth. But it's from all of that that the great American empire ultimately begins to emerge. The world's highest standard for living and wealth. So without further ado, we can move past this. These are the paradigms and the flow of information that we would utilize during the second half of the course in the spring semester, starting appropriately, normally, right around the time of Martin Luther, that we would celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. So we dedicate the first couple of sessions to looking at not only the modern civil rights movement, we also look at the suffragette movement, which, formally started in the 1800s. And we look at the role of women, as well as that great movement that occupied most of the 1960s, the civil rights movement. We look at issues of reparations for the native indigenous population. We look for the reparations in the context of what happened in World War II with Japanese American US citizens. We look at the issue of reparations for those who were the descendants of those who were enslaved on those plantations. We look at the whole concept of life chances. And for many students for many years, they would look at the concept and we would study it. And to many of them, it was only a matter of academics in a sense. Then the pandemic struck, and they began to see how their theoretical understandings began to become real life circumstances, where we looked at the intersections of race, sex, and class and economics. And students could begin to see that indeed, as we began to literally become shut down in the culture, um, other kinds of interesting and disturbing things began to happen. You had people who had households where mostly everyone were hourly employees. As many of them lost their jobs, families found that they had to come to live together, maybe under one household, so that literally the analysis and the information that we had laid in place became very instrumental in the students and the kind of real time analysis that people have been able to do for the last 13 or 14 months. We looked down at item number 13, technology and society and identity. I often remind the students that when I was a college student, I could go into someone's home, and normally at some point you might see a room or shelves on a wall that would indicate perhaps the majority of the books that that person had read in their lifetime. And then we think about the emergence and evolution of ebooks and how people can have books and all kinds of material right at their fingertips in their on their cell phones and cellular, their smartphones. And we have to always make a slight joke that we should they're smarter than we are for the most part. We look at the impacts of globalization, not only on this country, but on understanding our relationship to the larger world community. We are all in some type of a symbiotic relationship. It takes a lot of material goods to sustain the American population. So we help all of us to understand that, for example, we've got Mother's Day coming up. A couple of months ago, we had Valentine's Day, lots of flowers. Where are those flowers grown? How do they get to various locations throughout this country? Do we grow all the flowers that we sell on holidays? No, but we rely upon not only our domestic growers, but international growers. We rely upon the transportation infrastructure to literally get fresh items to us literally on a 24-hour basis. So while we sleep, our system of commerce continues to grow. And then hopefully, as you can see in item number 17, we hope that not only have the students enjoyed the courses and grown through the courses, but that ultimately also that they will become as citizens better in their civic engagement and influence in their careers. So that major paradigms we might look at as in terms of a flow are identified here. We look at processes of how we layer ourselves socially by sex, race, religion, and so forth. We look at identity formation. We look at models and systems of opportunity versus oppression. We offer to the students 50 or more books that they may look at and choose based upon their own interest and their own direction in life that they may then select and do further analysis on. This is just an overview to keep all of us somewhat sensitive to the complexities of backgrounds and heritage and locations, languages that make up, if you would, the American people, going back for the last 500 to 600 years. This is a rather graphic overview of what our community looks like, looking in the middle from the time we were born until the time that we grow and move further and further, into the society in terms of developing our education, our careers, and so forth. Here we have a slightly different, more scientific approach to that same system. But as scientists begin to look at the basic life processes, which all start with, an individual, and then we move through, as one scientist would develop it, numerous systems, from our intimate development of self and the nurturing of family environments, as we go outside before we even start school at the age of 5 or 6, playing with friends, going to a house of faith. Then we extend ourselves into our mesosystems, our exosystems, and then ultimately we are influenced also by the macro system, the values of societies and the groups that we have worked in. Then we get to the complexities of life in terms of our, if you would, social, psychological existence, our images of each other, our relationships to each other. And really, this is, as we look at this, the intersections of all of those variables as they come to play upon how the American drama unfolds between race, sex, classism, sexism, ageism. It's not very simple at all if one subjects this to a scientific study. What we can all do is agree that if America is not perfect, we have opportunities to help make it better each in our daily lives. And that is the challenge before all of us. We don't need to leave this solely to politicians, nor to our teachers, but it's up to each and every one of us to develop the power and the capacity to pitch in our own social space and make this a better place. Today, we're going to be blessed with 2 presentations from 2 students who have gone through this process. We're now going to look at the process of becoming who we are. We are indeed Americans, we are human, but also the factors within our intimate environments that make us who we are. So right now throughout America, I think our attention has been directed toward the Asian American population and all the complexities of it, all of the various geographical groups that make up the Asian American population. So we're going to be taking a microscopic look at that process as revealed to us by one author. And also, with many social movements impacting the entire globe, and particularly perhaps the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, and recent cries and shouts and demands for perhaps defunding the police. That's not as simple as it sounds, and it's not about simply defunding police. We have to remember that for the most part, firemen, teachers, and policemen in any local community are publicly funded. So when someone raises the notion of defunding anything, essentially what they are really saying is, what about restructuring our finances so that if we need to help make police a little bit better, some of them, in what they do, maybe we want to reallocate some of the monies to have maybe more social workers and psychologists join them and provide training so that indeed they can serve and protect. So without further ado, I'm going to be asking Juliana if she can now prepare her material. And I'd like each of the students, as they start, to tell you who they are, what year they are in school, where their hometowns are, what their ambitions are like, their majors, and what their plans are for the future, just so that hopefully it helps to personalize the presentation. So thank you so much for your time and for your attention. Thank you. Juliana.
Thank you, Dr. Pritchett. Um, let me- can everyone see my presentation full screen?
Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
we can.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you again to Dr. Pritchett for giving me the introduction. My name is Juliana Isabel Campbell. I am a sophomore at Seton Hall University. I am currently an SOBS major on the track to occupational therapy. I am also minoring in psychology. Originally, I am from Salinas, California, which is part of the Central Coast. I'm at Seton Hall. I'm part of the Filipino club called Flash, and I am actually the vice president. And my future plans would be, well, to hopefully start my career as be in my career as an occupational therapist, whether it be in a clinical setting, in a care home, or in the hospital. So yeah. My presentation today is based on the educational memoir by Dr. Andrew Shiem Chen, My Journey to Becoming Chinese American. Just a brief narrative about this memoir. Dr. Chen is a Chinese immigrant, and he began his educational journey in the University of Oregon. And the reason he came to America was because he gained interest in learning about the differences between Chinese and American society and culture. He also began fighting for human rights in his graduate year of college. And by talking about his own experiences through living in Taiwan, New York, Pennsylvania, Kansas, and California, he was a citizen, he was a teacher, and he was a student talking through these issues. And throughout the book, Dr. Chen made his main goal clear to inspire more cultural education, not just within the Chinese American community, but also the Asian American community and other ethnic groups as well, because during this time, from when he was born in the 1930s all the way to when he retired, especially in the 1990s, he saw a lot of racial and social issues within the Asian American community itself. And he wanted to he did his research, and he wanted everyone in America and even in China to understand that we're all human and we all have the ability to gain more knowledge, and with the power that we have to gain more knowledge, we should be able to understand people within their own culture. So certain policies that, or like kind of lessons that I saw within this book. Number one would be cultural education. As I said before, Dr. Chen really emphasized on the fact that our ability as humans to gain more knowledge and our ability to study and to learn more about other people is a gift to us. So he believes that through cultural education, we can be able to learn more about other people and understand people within their own cultural and racial context. And he himself, along with his wife Veronica, actually established a Chinese family summer camp in Pennsylvania when they lived there. And it doesn't have to be as big as establishing a school or establishing some sort of institution to educate children, especially, and to educate ourselves about different cultures. It really starts within your own family and your own family's ability to be open about different cultures and different societies, and talking to your family and to your children about how people are different and how, because they are different, we shouldn't treat them any less human. The second policy I have is practicing cultural relativism over ethnocentrism. Cultural relativism, is basing and studying people and looking at their behavior based on the standards of their own culture as opposed to your own culture. Ethnocentrism is the complete opposite, where you study and you look at the behaviors of a person and you essentially judge them based on the standards of your own culture. And that's something that I believe that we should stop doing. And Dr. Chen would say the same as well, because if you're going to judge people on the standard of your own culture, you have tunnel vision. You're not very open-minded, and you're not open to what their culture has to offer, and you're not open to understanding more about their culture. And the comic I have on the right, I'm not sure if you guys can see it, but the man on the left is saying, you know, you should be more like me, because what because you should like give up your own way of life. You should be more like me. And then the woman on the left is saying, oh, like, you look so unique, you look so beautiful, I want to learn more about you. And the woman on the right is how we all should be, in a sense, where we have to understand people based on who they are, where they came from, how they grew up. And even within America as well, within our own family structures, um, we all live in the same country, but we're all different in any sort of way. We're all humans, but at the same time, we grew up with different values. We grew up in different homes. We grew up with different rules, and it's important to understand that the way you grew up, the way you were taught, isn't entirely the same as the other person in front of you. And the third policy that I have is fighting for all human rights. At the very end of his memoir, Dr. Chen, he was part of the OCA, which is the Organization of Chinese Americans. And in the 1990s, there was a professor, Dr. Wenho Lee, who got wrongfully arrested because he was allegedly a Chinese spy. And Dr. Chan found it upon himself to fight for Dr. Lee and to get him out of FBI and police custody. And the leader of the OCA himself explained that we shouldn't be fighting for him because it is, quote unquote, a foreign issue. And Dr. Chen was taken aback because he said the mission of the OCA is not only to fight for the lives and the rights for Chinese Americans, but to also fight for the lives and the rights of every human individual, no matter what ethnicity, no matter what racial group you're part of. So that's something I believe all of us should practice is we shouldn't just be limited to our community, to our culture, to our group. We shouldn't just be limited to fighting for our own group, but to fight for other groups as well, because it concerns us as human beings. Again, it doesn't matter whether we're different in our cultural or our ethnical standing. We're all human beings. We all deserve the right to live. We all deserve the right to speak. We all deserve the right to whatever beliefs we had. Some important individuals within the book are obviously Dr. Chen, because he is the author. Next would be his wife, Veronica, not just because he is his wife, but she was a main character and main support system of his life, as his mother. I apologize if I'm butchering it. Hugh Kizon. So these two ladies, well, from the very beginning, his mother encouraged him to go to America and to get an education, because during the time that Dr. Chen was born, he was alive, which was the 1930s in China. Japan invaded China, and there was an 8-year-long invasion in China. And what happened is Dr. Chen's family was part of the Nationalist Party, which was not allowed because as we know, the Communist Party mainly takes over China. And the communist soldiers were hunting his parents down. So Dr. Chen and his siblings all moved to Taiwan. And then and there, his mom said, I would like for you to go to America. And this was kind of a struggle for Dr. Chen because in Chinese philosophy, there is this concept of filial piety. And filial piety means as the son gets older and his parents get older, it is a responsibility and the duty of the son to take care of his parents. But his mom was completely okay with the fact that he goes to America, he gets an education, and he essentially does what he wants to do. His wife helped him establish the Chinese family summer camp in Pennsylvania, and she was also with him throughout all of his work as a teacher and also as a person fighting for human rights. The next two people I have are Professor Sun Kong-chun and Confucius. These two people, well, his professor was the main person who inspired him to take part in psychology and learn more about cultural psychology. Why are the Chinese and American societies completely different, and how are they different, and how does this impact the people within that culture, within that country? And I put Confucius because he references a lot of Confucius's writings and analects inside of his book. And the next person I have is Chuck Brochet. Oh, my apologies. Next person I have is Chuck Brochet, and Chuck is what Dr. Chen would say his only true friend when he went to college and when he went to live in Pennsylvania and in Kansas, because while he was still a teacher, Dr. Chen experienced microaggressions within his own community as a professor. Little things like commenting. There was this other colleague he had where he said, "Oh, Chen, you don't have a Chinaman's chance." And there was another instance where he explained to his colleague that there is a type of delicacy, which is a fish in China, that they would usually eat. And then when he came home from fishing with his wife, there was a dead fish in front of his doorstep, and he didn't know whether that was an insult or whether that was a gift. He was taken aback by all of these actions, basically. And next I have Iris Chang. Iris Chang, even though she was only part of like a small part of the book, I would say that she is one of the most important individuals here because she talks about a very important issue within her book called The Rape of Nanking. If none of you know, the Rape of Nanking, that is when Japan ensued a bloody massacre within Nanking, China. And her book was very controversial by the time it came out because so many people assumed that it was sort of a demand for Japan to apologize to China. But in reality, Miss Chang actually said that this is just an informative book. I didn't want anyone to stir any controversy. And then the last person I have is Dr. Wen-Ho Lee. I mentioned him before, where he was a Chinaman who was a professor in California who got wrongfully accused as a Chinese spy. There were a lot of dates in this book, but these are just a couple dates that I have right here. So the very first is the birth of Andrew Chen. In 1937, there was a Japanese invasion of China, and then from 1937 to 1938, there was the Japanese bloody massacre in Nanking, China. And then in 1945, on August 5th, Japan finally surrenders to China. And then we have the Chinese Revolution in 1949. And in 1954, Dr. Chen begins his journey in the U.S. at the University of Oregon, pursuing a major in educational psychology. And then in 1963, Dr. Chen and Veronica got engaged, and they were both studying in New York, pursuing their PhDs, I believe. And then in 1963 of August, Dr. Chen moves to Kansas for work. In 1964, Dr. Chen and his wife both got married. In 1967, there was the birth of their eldest son, Thomas, and Dr. Chen was naturalized as an American citizen. In 1970, there was the formation of the first Chinese school in Pennsylvania, and Dr. Chen completed his PhD. In 1971, there was the birth of their only daughter, Andrea. In 1973, China and the United States reopened their diplomatic relations. In 1980, there was a national anti-diversity movement within Pennsylvania and within America. In October of 1991, Dr. Chen wrote to Chancellor James McCormick, which was actually one of his classmates in the University of Oregon. And he wrote to him because he believed there was a lack of services for Asian Americans in Pennsylvania in terms of what say they have in the local government and their education. And it was rejected, unfortunately. In 1997, there was Iris Chang's publication of The Rape of Nanking, which again, it immediately stirred a lot of uproar within the community. In 1999, Dr. Chen and Veronica moved to California for their retirement. And this is also the year where Dr. Wen-Ho Lee is arrested for allegedly being a Chinese spy. So Dr. Pritchett wanted us to include certain concepts that we learned in our Peoples and Culture of America class, and also tie it into how does it essentially relate to our class. And the first concept I have was the concept of a chair. And when Dr. Pritchett was talking about it, the one thing that stuck in my mind was he said that, we take a chair for granted because once you're in a room without any chairs, that's when you're looking for a chair. Because everywhere we look, there's some sort of furniture that we can sit on. And without a chair, I don't think anyone would want to sit on the floor. But how I tie it into this book is in relation to when you're in a room without a chair, you kind of take it for granted. And in terms of culture, what I think of how it can relate is, with culture, it's something part of our individual lives and within our community as well. No matter where you're from, no matter what culture you're a part of, it's something that is part of you, and it's something that you grow up with. And without, I wouldn't want to say proper education, but at least some sort of knowledge about your own culture and some sort of knowledge or wanting to learn about more of other people's culture. And this is something that I've experienced as well when I was younger, and many of my other friends have experienced as well, is as a Filipino, I've been blessed with parents who've continuously taught me about my culture, but I do have friends where they don't know anything about the Filipino culture. They don't know how to even speak any sort of Filipino dialect. And when you're in a room with people where you're the only person in there of your culture, and people ask you about your culture, and you don't know anything, you don't know how to respond, it's like, well, now I wish I knew more about my culture. And if you're in a room where you're with people of a similar culture and they're all discussing like what kind of traditions you guys have on Christmas, or what kind of traditions you guys have on Easter, simple things like that, you still feel a little bit left out. And again, you wish that you learn more about your culture. And it's not entirely the individual's fault as well, but in that sense, it's kind of like, wow, I wish I knew more about my culture so I can contribute something to the conversation. But at the same time, what I've seen people shaming other people for not knowing anything about their culture or not knowing how to speak their native tongue. And in that case, it's unfortunate and it's sad that people are being shamed for not knowing anything about their culture and not knowing how to speak their native tongue. Because in reality, you can still learn about your culture, you can still learn a different language, and there's nothing stopping you from learning a new culture. The second concept I would have is immigration, and we also learned this in the class with Dr. Pritchett, where the Chinese and many other ethnic groups who come to America immigrate here for numerous different reasons. For the Chinese, according to Dr. Chen, majority of the Chinese Americans come here to look for an education, and the rest either come here because of politics, or there's violence in their country that they want to get out of, or it's even for family, or, you know, providing for your family back home. And what I would say is with immigration, it's tough because my parents were immigrants and I was also an immigrant as well. My parents were immigrated here because they wanted to look for a better job to provide for their family and essentially provide for their children. So that's something I just wanted to throw in there. And then the very last thing I have is anti-Asian hate. As we're in the pandemic right now, and with this social, political turmoil we're in within the Asian American community, this book was very fitting because you see it within this book and within history as well. Anti-Asian hate didn't just start with COVID. It started way before, centuries before COVID. And I feel like the reason people don't talk about it as much, or the reason people kind of like brush it off, is because like within the Asian American community, we're silent, but at the same time, we're also silenced. And this happens with any ethnic or racial group that's experiencing any sort of hate, where you speak up about it, and then immediately it's like, oh, it's just a joke. Take it as a joke. Like, you shouldn't take it seriously. But, you know, bringing awareness to Asian American hate, it's happened for centuries. It's happened for such a long time. As a kid, I experienced that sort of hate, being, you know, bullied because of my eyes, being bullied because of the food I ate, being bullied because I was short and because I was dark. And it happens even within the Asian American community itself. Within the Filipino culture, as soon as I came to America, I spent all my time outside, and I got darker naturally because when I came here, it was summer. So I spent all my time outside. And then my grandmother said, like, oh, you got so dark. Like, why'd you get so dark? And I explained to her that I was playing outside. And she would tell me that, you know, a man wouldn't marry you because you're that dark. So it happens outside of your culture and even within your own culture as well. Relevance, again, anti-Asian violence is not new. It didn't just start with COVID-19. It didn't just start as soon as people were calling it the Chinese virus. It didn't just start there. It happened way before, even when the Chinese came here during the gold rush and during their building of the railroads. It happened there as well, because Chinese men weren't given the proper support and the proper necessities, and they weren't given the same amount of money as white Americans were given. And many children struggle with cultural identity. Dr. Chen's own son himself struggled with that as well. But he didn't know. That was the thing. He didn't know. And that's why Dr. Chen started writing about it and started researching about it, is because his own son didn't know that there is a difference when you say you're American, or you're Chinese American, or you're Chinese. He did his research, and 6 to 8% of children within Pennsylvania during the time said that they were Chinese, and 28% that said they were American, and 11% said they were Chinese American. And that's where the importance of cultural education comes in, because as children grow up, whatever culture they are part of, they should be learning about what culture they're part of, what traditions you guys have, what is right and what is wrong, or what's considered, you know, appropriate in that culture. And key takeaways, I would say, again, with cultural identity, it's important that children at a very young age understand what culture they're a part of and what that entails. And number two is cultural gap. Dr. Chen explained that there should be a balance between your native culture, like me. There should be a balance between my Filipino culture, but also the mainstream American culture that I'm a part of. There should be a balance in between that. Not saying that when one takes over, that's a bad thing. That's not entirely what he's saying at all, but he's just saying there should be a good balance in between. You learn about your native culture one day, and then you also take part in traditions and celebrations of the mainstream culture you're a part of. And then number three is social isolation, where I talked about it before, where you're in a group with people, whether you're the only person part of your culture or you're in a group with many people part of your culture. Again, it's like some people are ashamed for not knowing anything about their culture, or some people feel ashamed because they don't know anything, and they see other people their age knowing so many things about their culture, and that isolates them because it's a struggle again with their identity. It's like, oh, am I American or am I Chinese, or am I Filipino or am I Chinese, or am I both? And number four is language. Dr. Chen also brought this up in his book, where he said language is a big barrier for a lot of immigrants who come to America, because not everyone can understand English, and not everyone learned how to speak English when they came to America. And it's important for us to understand that just because someone doesn't know a language, just because someone can't learn a language, it doesn't mean that they're any less human. It doesn't mean that we can dehumanize them. It means that, let's try to teach them the language. Let's try to teach them what, mainstream American culture is about, as opposed to their native culture. So with that being said, thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and thank you, Dr. Pritchett, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. I think we might have you on the road to getting a master's degree, or before you've gotten your bachelor's degree. We're now going to turn to Kelly, who will be addressing, I think, a very timely topic also that focuses around our psychology and orientation to the concept of fear. Kelly?
Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen now and let me know if you can see it.
By all means. It's full screen.
All right, perfect. Hi everyone, I'm Kelly and I'm a sophomore majoring in social and behavioral sciences, but I'm also part of the 3+3 occupational therapy program. I'm from Somerset, New Jersey, and some things I'm involved in on campus. I actually just got approved for the Undergraduate Occupational Therapy Organization, which is really cool. So I have an e-board position in that club, and I'm also a part of RallyCap, which is a club that promotes physical fitness for children with special needs through play and activities. As well as I'm a part of the Latina Institute. So culture is a very important aspect in my life, and it's mentioned in this book. So I'll get started now. The book I read was called Defund Fear, Safety Without Policing, Prisons and Punishment by Zach Norris. So as for a brief narrative, Zach Norris took a unique approach into writing this book. Within each chapters, there were either really short or longer narratives that he would tie to modern social injustices. So these involved mass incarceration, solitary confinement, police brutality, which is really what I was focusing on this presentation. But for all these social injustices, he would provide the historical policies and people who helped cultivate these issues. To name a few, racism, discrimination, inequality, imprisonment, and lack of safety and security were some concepts mentioned. Finally, and most importantly for each issue, he also provided solutions, not only that individuals can take, but society as a whole, our government, big corporations, can take to help create a safer and more equal world. So the first individual I think is important to mention is the author, Zach Norris. Now, he went to a bunch of prestigious institutions, Harvard and NYU, but he had a lot of leadership positions as well. So he was the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, and that really wanted to provide more opportunities for people of color. He was the co-founder of Restore Oakland, which aimed to create a safer community in Oakland. And he was also the co-founder of Justice for Families. Now, this was a support network for families who had their loved ones who were incarcerated, specifically the youth from Oakland. But he was also a part of a bunch of other equality organizations and advocacy groups, but these were the ones that were most frequently mentioned in the book. As for additional individuals, the first two, Ella Baker and Martin Luther King, we could do a whole presentation just talking about their achievements and accomplishments, but to shorten it, Ella Baker was a hero from the civil rights movement that fought against racial segregation, and that same definition can apply to Martin Luther King Jr. He was an African-American leader in the civil rights movement known for his I Have a Dream speech. As for Durrell Fester, more unknown, but he was just an individual, which the author included his story. He was a child with ADHD who was a victim of California's youth prison system. And then I also included Trayvon Martin. It's so relevant to the time now with the Black Lives Matter movement, but he was initially the person who ended up sparking it because he was shot by George Zimmerman in 2012. And his death in 2013 really helped people come together and initiate and create this movement. As for some other additional individuals, these are more individuals who have a negative connotation towards them, but we have John Burge, who was a former police commander who was imprisoned for torturing a minimum of 120 mostly Black men to admit false confessions. And I say mostly Black men because he did target Hispanic and men of the Latinx origin, but majority of them were Black. We also have Richard Pratt, who was an American general known for initiating the idea of assimilation through total immersion. And I include him just to show the range that the author took in writing this book. He wasn't focused on a single minority group, but it spanned across numerous ones. For instance, Richard Pratt did this assimilation targeted towards the Native Americans. Richard Nixon was the 37th president of the United States, infamous for the Watergate scandal and his impeachment due to the abuse of power. But for our sake, he was really mentioned just because he initiated the largest prison building boom in human history. So this isn't a complete timeline of the prison boom by any means, but they were significant events that I really thought were important to mention. So in 1971, Richard Nixon initiated the war on drugs, and then following his presidency, Ronald Reagan stepped in and he escalated it. Then in 1984, prisons were able to be privatized because of mass incarceration. And this is tied with a lot of issues such as prison labor, but it just also significantly increased the amount of people who were being imprisoned. And then in 1986 is where you can clearly see racism embedded within the law because the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was created and it required 5 years of prison for possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine. But at the same time, it only required 5 years of prison for 500 grams of powdered cocaine. So you can clearly see 5 grams versus 500 grams is a significant difference. But the main reason why there was only a little amount of crack cocaine necessary to have 5 years in prison is because the Black communities were known for using crack cocaine, whereas the white communities were known for using powdered cocaine, and they wanted to imprison more Black people. They wanted to target them rather than target white people. So you can see that here. In 1993, the 3 strikes law became implemented, which I'll talk a little bit about in the future slides. And then in 1994, President Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which I'll also define later. And then in 2002, ICE is created. So essentially, these were the most highlighted events in the book, but it's not complete. There's still a lot that is tied in modern times to issues with the prison system, but especially during the 1980s, 1990s, there were a plethora of acts and laws that were targeted towards specific racial groups. So to define some of the timelines the statements I included earlier. The Violent Crime and Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 was an act which President Clinton passed to increase gun safety laws and treatment programs. But more importantly, it allotted billions for prisons and jails, as well as issued harsher sentences, most notably the Three Strikes Law. But since there was such a huge fund for these prisons and jails, they were just incarcerating numerous people, and the amount of inmates spiked around the 1990s. Then Three Strikes Law, I define it as a law that created a significant increase for prison sentences of individuals who were convicted of a felony, who had been prior convicted of 2 or more crimes, which typically resulted in a life sentence. So similar to baseball, on your 3rd strike, you're out of the game. Well, in this case, on your 3rd strike, you're out of society, and they're going to kind of keep you just locked away into having to fulfill your life sentence. Now, to take a step back a little bit earlier, we have 1980 tough on crime laws. This era resulted in a rapid increase in incarceration, and as a result, by the late 1990s, the majority of states passed laws to mandate youth to be tried in adult criminal courts for specific crimes. But on the brighter note, I also included a more new policy. It was created in 2014, and it was called Proposition 47, and it reduced penalties for possession of drugs and changed specific low-level crimes from felonies to misdemeanors. So we can also see in the state of New Jersey as well that times are changing. They legalized the use of marijuana recently, but we still have a long way to go in terms of trying to fix our past mistakes. So I included this timeline for one of the chapters. It was a child named Durrell, and to begin, he was diagnosed with ADHD from a young age. But due to the lack of programs suited for his special needs, he fell behind and started to skip school. Then his father was a single father, had multiple jobs. He wasn't sure what to do with him, so he decided to send him to a group home to hopefully get help, to hopefully have them motivate him to go back to school. But he did not like this group home. He was far away from his father. His dad didn't have the time to come up and visit him. So one of his fellow group home members was escaping, and he decided to join in with him. But what he eventually soon found out was his fellow group members stole this car. Because Durrell was a passenger in the car, he was given a grand theft charge and was then sent to California's youth prison, where he committed suicide. Now, in these youth prisons, abuse by the other inmates as well as the officers are very common. James's timeline is very similar in the beginning. However, since James' story occurred much prior to Durrell's, ADHD wasn't a common diagnosis, so he was labeled as hyperactive instead. And then, similar to Durrell, due to the lack of programs suited for his special needs, he fell behind and started to skip school. Because he was skipping school and had a lot of free time in his hands, wasn't sure what to do, he started making impulsive decisions and began smoking marijuana. And then he was eventually sent to California's youth prison for petty theft and possession of weed. Though his story continues, since James was older at the time of his arrest, he eventually aged out of the system and moved to an adult correction system and then a supermax prison. Now, in supermax prisons, solitary confinement is prevalent, and these people, these inmates, are being confined for 23 out of 24 hours of a day. So even for a person who doesn't have a prior mental diagnosis of anything, there's a lot of psychological damage that can occur along with physical damage. So organ failure is just one of them, but anxiety, depression, increased rates of suicide are all tied with solitary confinement. But because James also had ADHD, even though he was labeled as hyperactive, it affected him even more so, and his personality significantly shifted. His family said that he was unable to express emotions or any nice feelings at any time of the day, even when they would visit him. And then after being released, he went home and he killed his family's cat. So then his parents decided to send him to a mental health facility to get some help. but he escaped this facility and eventually murdered his parents. And I say that because there were a lot of intervention points that people, society, the world could have made to prevent both of these horrific endings from happening. And some key takeaways that I wrote were, one, we should allocate funding to different programs. So public schools should create programs tailored to students with special needs and should put more funding into their hands-on learning courses, teachers, as well as physical education, rather than just funding security and having your regular classes. Because if there were more hands-on activities, Durrell and James would have been more interested in class and they wouldn't have dropped out, most likely. I also wrote improve your relationships, whether that's relationships with family, guidance counselors, teachers. If one teacher or if one guidance counselor would have reached out to both children and encouraged them as well as motivated them to stay in school, they would have more likely stayed in school and they would have listened to them because they knew someone was looking out for them. The third takeaway I wrote was implement restorative justice over policing. Now, I didn't define restorative justice yet, which I will get into in a later slide, but it saves lives, and the book talks about that a lot. It is possible to take accountability and make amends without police intervention, but I'll go into detail on that later. And then the other one is know the juvenile corrections facility is not the only answer. There are programs such as intensive home therapy, especially with people who have diagnosis of, say, ADHD, and they're shown to be more effective and cost efficient, so better for the economy than the juvenile corrections facility. We should also have qualified first responders handle specific situations. First responders who know how to address people with mental issues or substance abuse should be called rather than police officers, because police officers aren't trained to the degree that first responders, such as, say, a social worker or a psychologist would be. And going back to the funding, we should also provide more funding to low-income communities and programs such as support systems for former inmates, just like Zach Norris was a part of, and Justice for Families, where it's a support network for families who have loved ones in incarceration. So here are some general concepts. Again, the book is talking about safety and policing, so it has to go back and find the roots and origins of how racism really is prevalent and how that endangers people of color. But Jim Crow laws were one thing that was mentioned quite frequently. And it's state and local laws that legalized racial segregation enacted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As for restorative justice, which is what I talked about earlier, which could have prevented both these youth to be incarcerated, we could have a system where, the criminal justice system is not focused on punishment as much as it is focused on rehabilitation and the well-being of offenders through reconciliation with the victims and the community at large. In restorative justice, there's still accountability, but the consequence isn't to be locked away and put into solitary confinement. It's better for the well-being of individuals. I also included Supermax prison, and these prisons were for especially violent and disruptive inmates, typically involve solitary confinement 23 hours per day. I also included an SEL program. Now, this is shown to be helpful for students with special needs, as well as like students with ADHD, for example, but it trains students how to be self-aware of others, how to set and achieve positive goals and make responsible decisions, along with learning how to exhibit empathy and compassion to create good relationships. If more schools had programs like these, then it would really help students who need it, who are struggling, to help make that connection with others. And then I also included a police-assisted addiction and recovery initiative. Programs that are helpful within the policing system exist, but they're not used, and how they actually act in reality is not what the description usually is. But this one provides training, support, and resources, which allows law enforcement agencies to make non-arrest pathways to the treatment and recovery of people, such as addiction. And I think assisted addiction and recovery initiatives should be used more widely because it could help so many people who don't need to be placed in jail. Avoid going there. As for a summary for an IDIS analysis, so we learned a lot about the civil rights movement, racism, discrimination, ableism, sexism, amongst many other things in class. And this book takes these topics and explores them further. For instance, when talking about ableism, it follows the personal account of African American children who had ADHD. Both these children stopped attending schools and eventually were placed in California Youth Authority prison, where assault and abuse were common. And both of these children had horrible and like sad outcomes, whether that was, being sent to a mental health facility, escaping, and unfortunately murdering their parents or committing suicide. And then to follow that, they were like ultimately failed by these several institutions we have in society. So in class, we discussed them. The institutions are family, worship, education, economy, and government. But if the government would have allotted more money to the economy, to public education, and implemented more outdoor and sensory activities that individuals with ADHD enjoy, perhaps they would have stayed in school, and these consequences of the death and the suicide could have been avoided. But also this book talks about the intersectionality people of color face. So just to talk about it, being a person of color, having a disability, being a young man who is a person of color, those all affect your life chances, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. And overall, the book is related to our course because it touches upon social injustices in the United States, which is the foundation of our class. As for the implications for America, this book is a direct call to action because it just provides solutions for every social injustice and all these problems that we have in our society. But it tells readers, since we don't invest in mental health resources, low-income communities, and have universal public health care, our country ends up spending billions on top of billions trying to band-aid issues when it's too late. People get sick, people die, people have to result in theft to try to survive, to have enough money to get medication, or even have enough money to get food. But this book is expanding our understanding of how past and current mistakes have severe consequences in the future. It tackles modern issues like the Black Lives Matter movement, but it traces its origin, for example, racism, it traces its origin to slavery. And in order to create a better environment, most importantly, we must actively work and become participants in our communities, fight for human rights, and be activists for important matters. Leaving issues up to the government can cause serious harm, as it did historically to numerous groups of people. So I created a model here because there were a lot of important topics mentioned in the book, but I have critical analysis pointing to power and institutional racism, because once you critically think about racism, you could see how it affects numerous sectors of life. For instance, because of racism, it affects policy development and advancement, just like we talked about the difference between crack and powdered cocaine. 5 grams of crack was given the same sentence as 500 grams of powdered cocaine, but the difference was because white communities used the powder and Black communities tended to use crack. So really racism was implemented in policy development. Same thing for civics and careers. Once more people are placed in prison due to racism, it affects the future careers they can have, because a lot of companies and organizations do not hire former inmates. But furthermore, most people who are affected by racism end up having careers that involve social justice too. It affects your life chances. I mean, look at today with our Black Lives Matter movement, because racism is causing people to die. Black people are getting shot at a much higher rate than any other race right now. And it also affects geography and ethnic distribution. As I mentioned earlier, the author is from Oakland, and he mentioned how there is a literal social distance between white communities, Asian communities, and Black communities in the area there. So I ended with a critical question, because a lot of people debate what restorative justice is and if it's too soft. So just to answer that, I wrote, restorative justice is finding harms in a situation rather than finding a person to target. The idea of restorative justice is not being tough enough is a huge misconception. It takes a different kind of toughness to be forgiving and hold accountability rather than to just put someone into solitary confinement and hide away problems. Real toughness with the restorative justice is hearing the pain you caused your community repetitively and making amends. And Norris broke down how restorative justice can be implemented. It starts in the home and stretches to areas such as the workplace, schools, corporation accountability, and neighborhoods. Say if Durrell, because he was charged with a grand theft auto charge, instead of going to jail, he had a restorative justice system where he could have made amends with the car owner, paid any fees for any damage, and he could have avoided being incarcerated and then being abused and then unfortunately committing suicide. But I end the PowerPoint with just critical questions I think are important to just think about because it's very prevalent to our time and it has always been prevalent in American history. But some of them I wrote were, is prison the best solution for people who break the law? And was there racism embedded in historical policies regarding imprisonment? Is there a more effective approach or alternative to prison that is better for the well-being of an individual and is more cost-effective? How should we reduce the rate of previously incarcerated people returning to prison? And how should law enforcement reduce harm towards people with special needs? And I think it's really important to think about just because there's too many people in prison. The United States has one of the highest rates of people in prison, and it is very unfortunate because once you become incarcerated, not only is it harder to find a job, not only do you lose rights such as like voting rights, but it takes a mental and physical toll on you as well for the worse. And then I just included my references, which was just the book, Defund Fear, Safety Without Policing, Prisons, and Punishment.
Thank you, Kelly. And I'm going to be asking if anybody who's watching this, if they have any questions, they can open their mics perhaps with Bert's assistance and or put something in the chat. But you did a very thorough job on that. Very proud of you, and I'm quite sure that the new club that you're about to launch can benefit from the assets that you're going to bring to it. So I congratulate you on taking the leadership of that. And also, I'm quite sure all of this research will serve you well in your 3+3 program. Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
No problem. I'm glad to have had a part in your growth experience if that's the case. All right, looking in the chat, I don't see any questions. I don't hear any coming in, but I want to thank you, the two of you. This ends our second symposium in the area of Peoples and Cultures of America for the 25th annual Petersheim Academic Expo. I'm so proud to coordinate this effort to give this type of exposure to our students. We hope it not only serves them well, but it motivates them to take their skills, their talents, and their gifts, to the highest level possible. When we can build these confidence builders through doing conference presentations and so forth. So on behalf of the Expo Committee, I'd like to thank any of you who will be watching this, via our campus teams, channels, and or eventually over YouTube. So thank you very much. I want to thank Bert Loxley also for his technical assistance. Without that, none of this would have worked at all. So Bert, we thank you publicly for that. So until we all meet again, thank you so much.